We're going over System Concepts Article 24, shells. Shells are not a negative force in themselves. They are controlled by the Creator within us, just like any other force. Shells are actually protection for people. When we fail to exert ourselves correctly with our desire in the group, we fall into a plateau that covers us in a shell until we restore ourselves to working correctly within the environment. One of the main reasons that Kabbalah was not disclosed to the common people was because they were not ready for its intensive power. However, this generation is different, since our will to receive has reached a ripening that is ready for desiring control over our lives. And here's a quote. The desired goal is none other than the choicest. This is the meaning of, and they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. This will be the first condition for all who begin the work. My words do not relate to those who settle for working and laboring to benefit people, and much less so for satisfying their contemptible cravings. Rather, it is for those who feel that it's not worthwhile to toil for people, but only for the Creator. It is so because there are many factions to Judgment Day. Number 1, to satisfy material possessions. Number 2, to benefit people. Number 3, to improve their own knowledge or that of others. But all these are forces of concealment of the face, for they are all as nothing compared to the merit of the Creator, of course. The article Remembering by Bala Sulam. Kabbalah is actually a very powerful system that can give us immense control, increase our will to receive tenfold, and amplify our willpower. With external acts of power, we can be aware and decide to overpower accordingly. Internal power is untraceable. We can manipulate events as we please without any resistance. The protection for this is called the first restriction, which defines the rule that internal power can be used only when the sense of self is the soul. There are 2 states we can sense ourselves as. Number 1, will to receive, the physical body in our reality. Number 2, will to bestow, the spiritual soul in our perception. The will to receive is designed to receive filling. The will to bestow is the combination of the will to receive with a screen, which before the barrier is the point in the heart. The screen enables us to control our will to receive. However, we can only express that control if our sense of self is the soul, experienced in the role of the Creator. We go through training of internal power after the spiritual barrier. This is called using the light as correction, light of mercy, of our perception. We cannot use this internal power in situations directly, although we do feel development and general overall changes in our relationship with experiences around us. When we pass the parsa, we express ourselves, which is called light of wisdom, using internal power. In the first stage, it helps us separate ourselves in situations and avoid getting caught in moments of egoistic turmoil. This is called smallness. When we reach greatness, we need to start expressing our internal power on others around us. It requires us to realizing, in actuality, that everyone is just a puppet for us to manipulate and use to gain more experience with our internal power. However, this can only be used if our sense of self is the soul, Creator. Internal power is disabled if we try using internal power when our sense of self is the ego. Here's a quote. Shells. These are the forces that control people so that they won't delve into anything until the end, but rather they are satisfied with less. That means that it's enough for them to have a slight shallow understanding that is like peeling the top shell from the wisdom and leaves the significant part. Therefore, the mind of the person won't help him understand how to work for the Creator, because the sins make the other forces control them, and therefore they cannot dwell as needed in the Torah and holy wisdom, and therefore they rebel against the Creator. From the book Ora Bahir by Bala Sulam. If we do not work to clean our concepts with the friends in the path, and instead allow our fear to overtake us, we fall into a shell that will lock us up. It will protect us from feeling the pain of dealing with our true expression of ourselves. We need to come to the realization that our childish dreams of love and unity will not happen in a shallow, light-headed way. Love is a serious issue and requires acceptance that the Creator within us has worked on our desires this way our entire lives, controlling our thoughts, emotions, and actions. Now is the time we join that force consciously. And here's a quote. And regarding the third question, about keeping the party with great exaggeration, it is so because this is how people behave when they are afraid that the baby will leave the house alone at night. They tell him, there is a bear outside and other wild beasts, since the baby cannot understand any other way. In other words, if he were to know the truth, that there is no lion or bear outside, but it is best for the baby to go to sleep, and most importantly to remain indoors, the baby wouldn't be able to accept the truth. Therefore, you should know, my brother, that to accept the path of the truth and the words of truth of Bala Sulam, there aren't many people who can hear the words of truth, for you are only seeing many kids. And what can I tell you while you're in kindergarten and you're impressed by them, writing to me that they are cheerful and gay? Indeed, so is the way of babies, to be cheerful and gay. But it is known that a baby is not taken seriously when crying or when happy, because its excitement and feelings are about unimportant matters. And when you see that the baby is crying during service, you are impressed. And when he is glad and dances, you are impressed. And you write that you envy the children for being cheerful and dancing. And what do you want? To be a baby all over again? You should know, my brother, that your childhood days are over, since before you walked into Bala Salam's room, you were dancing just as they are. Letter number 24 from the book Writings of Rabash by Baruch Shalom Alevi Ashlag. This generation is ready for internal power. The will to receive has reached the point where it causes too much interference with our goals. We need the method of Kabbalah to be able to mature our perception, where we can have control over our desires. The shells are designed to protect us until we have developed and evolved to the point that we can handle our internal power. This requires patience on one hand, but determination on the other, to be successful at our advancement. Shells make sure that undeveloped individuals will not care about having a deep understanding and desire to become the creator. They might even be opposed to it, to avoid even the slight activation towards their true purpose. These individuals should be left alone until they reach a point where they desire to advance. And here's a quote. In the third part, called Practical Learning, I explained how practical Kabbalists work not according to nature, since they have retreated to the initial degrees where there are plentiful pleasantness and sweetness. For this reason, their vital spirit significantly increases, such as you see among ordinary people, whose strong willpower activates the ones whose desire is weaker, forcing them to act as they wish, without any thinking or understanding, or any benefit for themselves. They follow and obey their every wish. Similarly, when one has exerts to attain those degrees that yield great vitality and spirit, they can activate it in their friends to a certain extent as well. It is so because the nature of the spiritual is as the nature of the fish at sea, where the big swallows the small when it thinks of it. Also know that this active power is so mighty that it can induce imaginations in one's friend to the exact same extent that every person has the power to imagine in one's own mind. And as far as dominion, it is much more powerful than the one who imagines it in one's own mind. It is so because one who depicts by himself has the power of intellectual critique, opposite the imagination. If it denies that imagination is weakened and cannot work at all. This is not so when one is activated by another. At that time, one is in a state of anarchy, without any work of one's machine, called the brain. For this reason, there will never be any criticism, but the imagination he has obtained from the other works in him as though he has long ago agreed to it wholeheartedly, and above any criticism, as though it's a type of prejudice. Moreover, one can clothe and suck the spirit of one's friend inside until he feels his feelings to an extent, and even his memories, and can contemplate them and determine which of them is desirable and notify him. This is why it's written that they deny the household of above, for although only the foul ones have come to them, they remain and use them permanently, and intensify their vital spirit more than genuine sages. From the article, The Quality of the Wisdom of the Hidden in General, by Bala Sulam. The system is designed perfectly. It might look on the surface as if things are spiraling out of control. Because we are still in development, the growth and surges we see look inconsistent. We need to build faith in the method and intermingle deeply within the group to survive the sharp declines and twists in our perception throughout the process. This requires us sharing our discernments and states with each other. The group can help us scrutinize and discern our state to avoid falling to such behavior. They represent desires outside of our current degree that can help us advance to a higher degree. Shells are when we aspire for filling instead of internal power. Filling of our physical desires such as stability, sex, money, and external power become our goal. Sometimes it is impossible for us to discern that we are in a shell. We enter denial of our fear to advance. We need to work with the group and individuals to help us overcome our concerns. Here's a quote. 2 parts to material studies. There are 2 parts to material studies. Number 1, reality. Number 2, their existence, the quantity and quality of their sustenance, and how they are attained, by whom and by what. For this reason, there is a very bitter taste in the spaces between each 2 degrees, and those who attain them loathe them vehemently. It is made and drawn upon them, so they will not remain there in the middle, as in the case with simple animals. However, sometimes the attaining turn back when they remember the great delight that is there. Klipa, shell, peel. No turning back in spirituality. When they return, it is already a different degree. When they return, it is already a different degree, and it is called klipa, shell, peel, in relation to the initial degree. 2 parts to practical learning. There are 2 parts to practical learning. The first, sanctity. The second is klipa. Sometimes, for some reason, sages too return to the place where there is a taste of great delight in order to do something. However, they promptly leave it and resume their place. For this reason, the return is also called sanctity. And yet, for the most part, only the cowardice and those of weak desire return there, wishing to avoid passing through the bitter path between the degrees. So they remain stuck there because they cannot rise to their aspired height. From the article, The Quality of the Wisdom of the Hidden General, by Bala Sulam. In every degree we go through shifts of thoughts and emotions dictated by our spiritual degree. The group should be used to provide a stable foundation so we can advance quickly without losing ourselves in the process. And here's the first workshop question. Number 1, what are shells? Daniel.
They are desires of the steel degree.
Mary.
They are forces and thoughts that force us to clean concepts before we advance. They come as a result of us being in our ego and not having the correct intention or having a dirty concept. They hold us in place until we clean our concepts.
Moshe.
I would say when your sense of self moves down into your ego, and it's all about filling, because it's comfortable there. But your true self needs to be the creator. And if you fall into a shell, you've basically fallen into filling.
Rick.
Well, it's like they were saying, it's when you lose your goal, you lose your way, you lose your aim, your intention, and you start looking at other things and thinking that is the pathway, and many times it's just egotistical and you're running away from the true work. So you plateau and you're covered in a shell. The shell is protection to keep you from falling further off the path.
Robin.
I agree with what's been said. It's a protection when you lose your way, when it protects you from the intensity of what your level is really, or what level you're close to, I think, and until you can get your concept cleaned or pull yourself out of your ego.
shells are definitely protection for a person. When someone doesn't clean a certain concept that becomes emotional for him, he basically gets overloaded by the intensity of that concept. And then the idea is that the shell protects him, that he won't do too much damage to himself. And normally it will cause him to, of course, like stop his spiritual advancement, but to make sure that his pain won't be from the lack of advancement, but rather will just be the pain of the concept itself, but in a reduced value. The second question, how do we handle friends who are not ready to advance? Daniel.
Just leave them until they want to come back.
Mary.
You can try and talk to them, and if they can see that they're in a shell, they might come out of it. But if not, you just have to leave them until they are ready to come back.
Moshe.
I agree. It's difficult to give somebody a desire to advance. Sometimes you need to give them pain and suffering instead. But it really is dependent on each person. You can do the best you can, but at some point you have to let them. You gotta let them loose so they can have the decision to come back on their own.
Rick. Robin.
I agree. You really can't do much. You can try, and maybe I'm sure they'll remember it after they come out. But they are in a shell with that pain of the concept that's wrong, and that intensity eventually they'll have to deal with it.
It basically depends on what degree a person is in a shell. If it's a small shell, then you can just basically, just clean the concepts without telling them that they're in a shell, and it can get them out of it. If it's a little deeper, then you sort of play with them a bit, and then you might actually tell them in a shell. They'll normally get angry, which is a sign that they actually are in a shell, because if someone's not in a shell, and you tell them in a shell, there's no response. But if someone's in a shell, they'll normally have a very negative response to it. But sometimes the shell is very deep, and then they just basically have to cool down and sort of allow the fear to subside, and then you can deal with them again. Third question: how do we as a group help each other avoid falling into shells? Daniel.
Oh, I don't know.
Mary.
We talk to each other. If we have a question, we can, just reach out to somebody or in the chat and say, hey, I'm not real clear on this concept. Let's talk about it. And also notice when somebody's backing off or is, kind of seems to be desiring more corporeal things. Just being close to each other and open.
Moshe.
Yeah, it has to be sort of like a pact, like a covenant, is that if you're reaching out to somebody, it's because you actually want to help them. Because most of the time when somebody's in a shell, they become very aggressive. It's like, it's going to be very tense. So, I think basically a covenant sort of needs to be put in place beforehand in order to sort of address that to the best that you can.
Robin.
Well, by investing in the group and being in it, I mean you develop trust, and you develop an intermingling of everyone's ideas and their attainments and their discernments, and so it helps to be able to have that reinforcement so that you can get guidance when you need it and clean concepts and continue to advance with them. And that environment really is a protection and a safety net.
Rick?
Which question you on, the third one?
Third one.
It's a matter of, as we go through this process and we're at different degrees, you can look back down the pathway and you can see where others are at. When you see they are having problems with a concept, their perception, you can take the time to go back and try to plant a seed, give them a new aim, a new way of looking at it, make them aware of what is being the obstacle, the blockage that is slowing them down. You can't tell them, but you can point it out in different ways. So it's by working together. It's by taking your friend within inside yourself and making his deficiency yours and sharing yourself with them. It's taking the time to invest in each other.
At the end of the day, the only thing that will save a person is the investment that they do in the group before they fall into a shell. Once they fall into a shell, it's basically too late. So depending on the investment that they've invested, not just like participation, but emotionally sharing states, basically being vulnerable to the group, that does a connection, and it makes it a very deep connection. And then even when a person falls into a shell, that connection still keeps them tied to it long enough so that when they come out of the shell, they're still in the group. And if someone doesn't do that investment, then they'll just, once they fall into a shell, they'll just leave the group. And that's okay. But the idea is if someone wants to advance, then they need to invest in the environment accordingly so they won't fall into a shell. And if they do fall into shell, to reduce the amount of time that they stay there. So what do you think of the article?
I thought it was great. I think it's important for everyone also to, really realize that it's a normal part of the process of development. It's a safety mechanism, and you're right, and that we do have to be vulnerable with each other and understand, that it's just part of the process, and we learn as we go. Just support each other.
That's why we need to be, when we find that we're vulnerable, or others are, we always need to show them at that time and everyone else who isn't in that point how to work together in connection and love, not being of any manner of disparity.
Yes, Moshe.
If you fall into a shell before the barrier, it's your sense of self is still always the ego before the barriers. So when you fall into a shell before the barrier, it's not the same type of shell if somebody, falls into a shell after the barrier where their sense of self is the creator and then they fall into the ego. So, what's sort of, how is that? Is there even a shell before the barrier?
So the idea that you could say technically there is no shell before the barrier, but we still call it a shell. The definition of a shell is when you return to a lower degree than you actually are. So for example, if someone's in phase 2, and that's the degree that they are, then it's fine, it's not considered a shell. But once they're aware of phase 3, and they go to phase 3, and then they fall back into phase 2, now phase 2 is called a shell. So the idea is that even though beforehand, when they were in phase 2 is holy and sanctity, once they advance to phase 3, and if they fall back to phase 2, then suddenly phase 2 becomes a shell. So it's always relative to the person. So for one person's trash is another person's treasure. So the idea is that for one person, phase 2 can be a shell. And for somebody else, the phase 2 can actually be sanctity because they're in phase 1, they're meant to advance to phase 2, or they've got more phases to advance in phase 2. So the idea is that really to notice the relativity. It's like it's okay for a child to be a child, but when an adult behaves like a child, we normally say it as something derogatory. It's like stop behaving like a child. So you could say that before the barrier, there isn't a real shell because you are in the ego in the first place. So there we just say it's the shell of the degrees. And after the barrier, the shell is when you still think your sense of self is the creator, but actually your sense of self is falling into the ego. And that's a real shell. Because you think you are the creator, but you aren't actually, you're basically lying to yourself.
Well, that's cool. I mean, we can make that distinction between the two. There's two different types of shells. You can say sort of shells of, your, level of advancement going sort of backwards and enjoying sort of past the light, and a shell of sort of your sense of self, which is considered a real shell in the first place.
Yes.
Well, I think that article is very, very good, and I think it's valuable because it is something that you're going to witness and be in at some point or another, and it's good to know how to deal with it and what's going on. I thought it was very thorough.
It was a little long, but I think it touches the subject in many of its expressions, you could say. I actually remember when I wrote this article about 8 months ago or something like that, and I remember when I found the article, the quality of the the quality of the wisdom of hidden in general, Qadr Salam. I remember when I read it and actually got a little fearful because it talked about the whole thing of basically controlling the friend's desires and stuff. And at the beginning, I was actually worried whether to write about it and release or not. In the end, the reason I decided to write about it, I was like, this article is on the Kabbalah Info website. So, if it's on the BV website, then that is probably a sign that it can be disseminated freely and actually talked about and brought to attention.
So basically, to avoid falling into the shell, or the preparation we have to do in the group is to remind each other how important it is to take full control over our lives.
Yeah, you could say one of the signs when someone falls into a shell is they fall into victim mentality. They start to say, "Oh, I can't do this. I guess I just wasn't designed for this. I don't have the qualities that others have." And basically falling into that self, like self-shame and self-blame and feeling like unworthy. And so that's like one sign. The other sign is when you fall into that victim of blaming somebody else, like, "Oh, Zaka, you're the problem." And the idea is that both of them are a shell because they're just basically unnecessary. Like if you're advancing, the idea is to use your environment, which includes the materials, the friends, the teacher, and so forth, to the best of your advantage. So there's no need to actually fall into any kind of eating yourself up or blaming others, because that just shows that you're not trying to advance anymore. Like someone who blames others is basically someone who doesn't want to advance. And therefore he wants the feeling of either eating himself up, which is great feeling, or blaming others. Like we've all had this time where we want to complain about the government, or we want to complain about the company, or we want to complain about our wives or our husbands or our friends, whatever. It gives us immediate feeling, immediate enjoyment without having to do anything. And the idea is to actually advance. You basically don't have time to complain if you're advancing correctly. So I would say that a shell and victim mentality go hand in hand. Maria asks, can one assess oneself or only another at a high degree can tell that one is in a shell? Can one catch it and then prevent spending a long time there? So someone who's on a high degree, it's much easier for them to notice that someone on a low degree is in a shell. Someone on a low degree can notice if they're basically told by somebody else. They can, like, somebody else can say, do you read their conversation? Do you see how they're just basically contradicting themselves? That's another sign of a shell, where basically nearly every sentence you say contradicts itself. You'll be like, we all have to love each other and you've got to stop what you're doing. We have to accept everyone and you're terrible. And just all different things where it's just so contradictory. Like, Zaka, you're so egoistic, but, don't stop helping me advance egoistically. It's like I thought you said. And it just, they tend to give very contradictory sentences. And that's one of the ways to sort of identify it, but externally. On later phases, you can also identify it internally. You can actually feel the internal power of somebody else. And then when they fall into a shell, their internal power becomes unstabilized. And you can feel it. And you know exactly who is falling into a shell. And you can feel it even before there's even an external expression. So it is, you can feel someone in a shell even before they know they're in a shell, before anybody else knows that they're in a shell, before they've even expressed any sign that shows externally that they're in a shell. You can feel it in the internality before it even expresses itself in externality. But that's normally on a high degree. It's normally only Atzilut and above. Can one catch it? Basically, if you're catching it, you're not in a shell anymore. It's like, I always give the example of falling into a shell, like falling into a pool. When you get out of the pool, that's when you say, oh, I'm soaking wet. When you're in the pool, you're not actually soaking wet. So when you get out of the pool, then you look down and you're like, oh, I'm soaking wet. So that means when you say, oh, I'm in a shell, it probably means you're not in a shell, because you're just looking at yourself after you've left a shell and you're looking like at the water, you could say, soaking off you of like the leftovers of the shell, the leftover fear. So one of the things that if someone's in a shell, they probably won't agree that they are. But if someone agrees that they're in a shell, they probably aren't, because they've gone out of it.
So we can say that a descent is a potential of a shell. It could go into a shell if we don't handle the descent properly. And could we say that just generally just asking the question, what is this descent about? How does it help my advancement? What am I not seeing? Those are all questions that we can kind of have as a checkpoint for ourselves when we go into a descent to help us stay out of a shell.
So you're right. If you're in a descent, the best thing is to actually start discerning and discerning what is the concept that is actually bothering you, because you can collect many discernments which are not related to what you're actually dealing with, and then if you don't deal with the issue that caused you the descent in the first place, it can just be so strong that it makes you fall into a shell. You could say someone who's in a shell thinks they're in an ascent, but they're actually still in a descent. Like everything is fine, but everything is not fine. Again, that inconsistency in the self. There can also be a shell when someone's actually in overenjoyment, when they're enjoying themselves too much, and therefore they feel no need to actually advance as well. I think we'll stop here and into the after party.